I never imagined that I would question my beliefs. From a young age, I was taught that Jehovah's Witnesses held the truth. My parents were devoted members, and I followed their example without hesitation. Everything in my life was centered around the congregation: meetings, Bible studies, and door-to-door preaching. It wasn't just something we did, it was who we were. I wholeheartedly believed that we were the only ones who truly understood God's plan, while other religions were misled, following false teachings. We were different, set apart. For years I preached this message, telling others that Jehovah was the only true God and that salvation could only be found through his organization. I believed that when people died, they simply ceased to exist, as we were taught. No heaven, no hell, just unconsciousness until Jehovah resurrected the righteous in his kingdom. Death never frightened me because I believed I would peacefully sleep, waiting for Jehovah to bring me back to life. However, over time, small things began to trouble me. At first I ignored them, but I started noticing changes in the organization's teachings. What we once believed to be absolute truth was being replaced by new interpretations. I had always been taught that Jehovah's truth never changed, so why were the doctrines constantly shifting? I tried to push the thought away, reminding myself that Jehovah reveals things gradually, as the elders had always said. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more questions arose. I started hearing about people who had left the faith, apostates as we called them. We were warned to stay away from them, as they were deceived by Satan. Yet some of them shared a different story. They said they found Jesus after leaving, and that didn't make sense to me. I had spent my entire life learning about Jesus and teaching others about him in my ministry. How could people find him after leaving Jehovah's organization? Wouldn't that mean they never truly knew him before? I knew I couldn't ask these questions aloud. Questioning the doctrine was dangerous and could lead to being labeled spiritually weak, or worse, being disfellowshipped, cut off from my family, friends, and everything I knew. So I buried my doubts and told myself I just needed to study harder and pray more. I avoided anything that might plant seeds of doubt in my mind. When someone said something contrary to what I had been taught, I shut it out. But deep down, the unease lingered. Then everything changed. I had been feeling unwell for weeks, but dismissed it as just exhaustion from work and stress. One night, while preparing for bed, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was unlike anything I had ever felt. Deep, crushing, radiating through my arms, and my breathing became shallow. I tried to remain calm, but my body wasn't cooperating. The room started spinning, and my vision blurred. I stumbled forward, trying to grab onto something, but my legs gave way, and I collapsed to the floor. I could hear my wife's frantic voice in the distance, calling my name. I felt hands on my shoulders shaking me. I tried to speak, to tell her I was okay, but no words came. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, and then everything went black. I had always believed that death was simply sleep. When my body gave out, I thought my consciousness would disappear, and I would cease to exist until Jehovah resurrected me. So I waited for nothingness, but it didn't come. I was still aware, still conscious, but no longer in my body. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. I could see the room around me, my wife kneeling by my body, crying and shouting my name. I could see the panic in her eyes and the way her hands trembled as she tried to wake me. But I felt nothing. No pain, no struggle to breathe. I felt lighter than I ever had before. There was no weight, no pressure, no feeling of being confined to a physical body. It was as if I was standing just outside myself, watching everything unfold. I tried to speak, but she couldn't hear me. I realized that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't supposed to happen. I had spent my whole life believing that when we die, we simply cease to exist. There was no awareness after death, no soul continuing on. We didn't go to heaven. We didn't go to hell. We just stopped. And yet I was still here. A wave of panic swept over me. I must be dreaming, I thought. This couldn't be real. I tried to wake up, but nothing changed. I looked down at my body. It lay motionless on the floor, pale with slightly parted lips as my wife sobbed. The longer I stared, the more I felt detached from it, as if my body was just a shell, a thing, and I no longer belonged to it. Then I heard a noise. At first I thought it was just my wife's crying, but it was something else. Whispers, faint at first but growing louder. I turned toward the sound, and what I saw made my stomach churn. The room began to change. The walls stretched unnaturally and the shadows grew longer. The air grew heavy, suffocating, pressing against me like an invisible weight. The whispers grew clearer, but the language was unfamiliar, and the tone was dark, twisted. I tried to move, but I wasn't in control. I wasn't touching the ground. I was floating. Then I felt something pulling me downward, a pressure that wasn't physical, but powerful and unrelenting. It dragged me towards something I couldn't see. I fought against it, but it was useless. The darkness around me thickened, and the whispers turned into a chorus of overlapping voices. Some sounded angry, others mocking, but all of them filled me with dread. I realized, without fully understanding how, that I was being taken somewhere. I had spent years believing there was no hell, that when people died, they ceased to exist. But what if I had been wrong? What if there was something beyond death? I wasn't ready to find out. I cried out, not knowing who I was calling to, only that I needed help. Then as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the pressure vanished, and the darkness shattered. A blinding light filled the space, cutting through the shadows like a blade. It wasn't just bright, it was overwhelming, powerful, and as it washed over me, I felt something I hadn't in what seemed like forever. Peace. The fear that had gripped me moments before faded, and the weight pressing against me disappeared. For the first time since leaving my body, I could breathe again. I turned toward the light, drawn to it, and when I did, I saw him, a figure standing at the center of the radiance, bathed in warmth and purity. At first, I couldn't make out his face, the light was too bright, but deep in my soul, I knew who he was, Jesus. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't possible. Jehovah's Witnesses taught that Jesus wasn't divine, that he was merely Jehovah's first creation, a messenger. We prayed through him, but not to him. He wasn't God, yet there he was. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. His presence was overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever known. The love, authority, and power radiating from him were beyond words. Then he spoke. David, my name. It wasn't just a sound, it was a call, pulling at something deep inside me, something I had buried beneath years of doctrine and teachings. David, he said again, his voice calm and steady. Do you know me? The question hit me like a thunderclap. Did I know him? Of course I did. I had studied his life and ministry. I had preached about him and told others to follow his example. But as I stood there staring at him, I realized something that shook me to my core. I knew about him, but I didn't know him. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but no words came. Jesus stepped closer, and the light around him seemed to pulse, alive. There was no anger in his expression, no disappointment, only understanding. You followed an organization, he said gently. But did you follow me? My mind scrambled for an answer. I had followed Jehovah. I had obeyed the teachings of his organization. Wasn't that the same as following Jesus? But deep down, I already knew the answer. No, it wasn't the same. My knees, if I even had knees, felt weak. I wanted to collapse under the weight of the realization. I had spent my entire life believing I was serving God, but I had never truly sought Jesus himself. And now, face to face with him, I understood the one thing I had been missing all along. I had never truly known him. I stood there frozen, staring at him. His presence was overwhelming, strong yet peaceful, powerful yet full of love. I had spent my entire life preaching about him, talking about his role in Jehovah's plan. But standing before him now, I felt something I never expected. A deep, unshakable certainty that I had never truly known him. The weight of that realization crushed me. I wanted to speak, to explain myself, but no words came. What could I even say? I had spent my whole life devoted to an organization, thinking it was the only path to salvation. I had dismissed every person who tried to tell me that Jesus was more than I had been taught. Jesus didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, waiting. Not in anger, not in disappointment, just waiting. And somehow that made it worse. I forced myself to speak, my voice shaking. I know who you are. Jesus tilted his head slightly as if studying me. Do you? My heart, if I even had one, ached. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him I had followed him my whole life, that I had taught others to do the same, that I had gone door to door spreading what I believed was his truth. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had followed rules, I had followed men, I had followed doctrines, but I had never followed him. Tears burned in my eyes. I thought I did, I whispered. Jesus stepped closer, the light around him radiating warmth. You followed a path given to you by men, but I never asked for that. I swallowed hard. I had always been taught that Jesus was important, but only as a mediator. He wasn't Jehovah. He wasn't to be worshipped or prayed to. But the longer I stood in his presence, the more I came to understand how insignificant that teaching was, how incorrect it had been. Jesus wasn't just significant, he was everything. I felt my legs begin to give way, but rather than collapsing, I simply lowered myself to my knees. My hands shook as I stared down, unable to face his gaze anymore. The weight of what I had believed, what I had preached, what I had dismissed, it was overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I felt empty. Not because I had lost something, but because I realized I had never truly had it at all. Jesus knelt before me, his voice both soft and strong. You spent your life seeking truth, but you never asked me to reveal it. I clenched my fists. He was right. I had always believed that we had all the answers, that everything we needed to know had been given to us through the watchtower and the governing body. We were told not to look elsewhere, not to question, not to think independently, and I had followed that instruction. But I had never gone to Jesus himself. I had never asked him, and now faced with the truth, I felt foolish. I was trying, I said, my voice barely audible. I was doing what I thought was right. Jesus nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. And now that you know the truth, I swallowed hard. I don't know what to do. Jesus gently placed his hand on my shoulder, and warmth flooded through me. Not just warmth, but understanding. It was as though he could see every thought, every memory, every doubt I had ever experienced, and he loved me despite it all. My entire life I had been taught that salvation came from following Jehovah's organization, that obeying his commands as passed down through the governing body was the only way to survive Armageddon and enter his kingdom. But now, standing before Jesus, I realized something that shattered everything I had believed. It was never about an organization. It was always about him. Tears fell down my face. I don't deserve your mercy, I whispered. Jesus gave a sad smile. No one does. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. Then why are you giving it to me? His eyes softened. Because I love you. Those words hit me like a wave, not because they were surprising, but because I had never truly believed them before. I had always seen Jesus as a distant figure in history, important but not personal. But this was different. This wasn't distant. This wasn't doctrine. This wasn't something I had read in a magazine or heard at a meeting. This was real, and it was undeniable. Jesus stood up and extended his hand. Come with me. I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of a sense of unworthiness. I don't know how, I admitted. Jesus didn't move his hand. You don't have to. Just trust me. I had spent my whole life trusting an organization, trusting men in suits who claimed to speak for God, trusting that every decision they made was from Jehovah himself. But I had never truly trusted Jesus. I stared at his hand, my breath catching in my throat. And for the first time in my life, I made a choice. Not based on what I had been told, not based on what I had been taught, but based on the truth before me. I reached out, took his hand, and let him lead me into the light. I felt warmth the moment I touched his hand. It wasn't just warmth, it was life. It was love. It was something I had never known before, something no Bible study or Kingdom Hall meeting could have given me. As Jesus guided me forward, the light around us grew brighter, but it didn't hurt my eyes. It was pure, alive. It wasn't just light, it was understanding, truth, everything I had been missing. Without him speaking a word, I knew I was about to see something that would change me forever. We stepped forward, and suddenly the world around us changed. I wasn't floating anymore. I was standing. The place we were in wasn't heaven, not the way I had imagined it. It wasn't clouds or golden gates. It was vast, endless, filled with a presence greater than anything I had ever felt. Jesus turned to me, his expression full of love, but also something else, sorrow. What I'm about to show you, he said, is the truth. I swallowed hard. The light around us shimmered, and in an instant, I saw my life unfold before me. Every moment, every decision, every time I had preached to someone at their door, every time I had told them their beliefs were wrong, every time I had claimed the only way to salvation was through Jehovah's organization. I had thought I was saving people, but as I watched myself, I saw something I had never noticed before. I saw their faces, not just the polite nods and forced smiles, but the confusion, the doubt, the heaviness they felt after I left. Being told their entire faith was wrong, that their love for Jesus wasn't enough, that they had to do more to be accepted by God. I saw a young woman, barely out of college, crying after I walked away from her door. She had believed in Jesus her whole life, had trusted him, had prayed to him, and I had told her faith wasn't enough. I saw an elderly man sitting alone after I left, his head bowed in prayer, asking God if he had been deceived. I had done this. I had spent my life teaching people that Jesus wasn't who they thought he was. I felt a tightness in my chest. I was just trying to help them, I said weakly. Jesus nodded. I know, but I was telling them what I had been taught, I said, my voice cracking. I believed I was doing the right thing. You were sincere, Jesus said, but sincerity does not equal truth. The words struck me like a hammer. I wanted to argue, to explain, but I had no words. What could I say? It was true. I had believed with all my heart, but that didn't mean I was right. Tears burned my eyes as I turned back to the visions before me. Then I saw myself, not preaching, not knocking on doors, just me alone in my room, sitting with my Bible, staring at the pages with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I remembered that moment. It had been late at night. I had been reading a passage about Jesus, his words in the Gospels. Something about it felt different, like it was speaking directly to me, but I had ignored it. I had closed the Bible and picked up a Watchtower magazine instead, seeking the organization's explanation. I had done that so many times. Whenever something in Scripture didn't align with what I had been taught, I didn't pray about it. I didn't ask Jesus to help me understand. I went straight to the organization's publications because that was what I had been trained to do. I clenched my fists, my entire body shaking. I never sought you, I admitted. Jesus didn't say anything. He simply looked at me, waiting. A sob escaped my chest. I thought I knew everything. I thought I had the truth. I shook my head. But I never even asked you. My knees hit the ground as I realized the full weight of it. I had spent my entire life learning about Jesus, but I had never truly known him. I'm so sorry, I whispered. Jesus knelt beside me, placing his hand on my shoulder. I'm not showing you this to condemn you, he said softly. I'm showing you so you can understand. I wiped my face, struggling to breathe. Understand what? That I have always been here, he said, waiting. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. I have never needed an organization to reach you, he continued. I have never required you to follow men's rules to know me. A lump formed in my throat. Say, you spent your life believing that salvation was through an institution? Jesus said, his voice gentle but firm. But salvation has always been through me. Tears spilled down my cheeks. I had been so blind. I would have listened if I had known, I choked out. Jesus gave me a knowing look. Would you? I swallowed hard. If someone had told me this while I was still alive, fully devoted to the organization, would I have listened? The answer cut me deeper than anything else. No, I would have ignored them, dismissed them as misled. I would have called them an apostate. I squeezed my eyes shut, shame flooding through me. I didn't know, I whispered. But now you do, Jesus said. I opened my eyes, searching his face. What now? Jesus reached out, and for the first time, I noticed something on his wrist. A scar. The moment I saw it, something inside me broke. Everything I had been taught, everything I had believed, all came crashing down. I had spent my life being told that Jesus was important, but not enough, that faith in him alone wasn't sufficient, that salvation required more. And yet here he was, scarred, alive, holding out his hand, as if waiting for me to finally understand. His voice barely a whisper. Follow me. I stared at his hand. It should have been an easy choice. I should have taken it without hesitation. But I didn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Following Jesus meant letting go of everything I had ever known, everything I had ever believed. It meant admitting I had been wrong. That realization cut deeper than anything else. I had spent my entire life believing I was part of the one true faith, that Jehovah's Witnesses alone had the truth, that we were the only ones who truly understood God's will. I had given everything to that belief, my time, my energy, my loyalty. I had built my whole life around it, and now in the presence of Jesus himself, I had to admit it had all been a lie. A deep ache settled in my chest. I don't know how to do this, I whispered. Jesus didn't move, he just kept his hand extended toward me, waiting. You don't have to know how, he said. You just have to trust me. Trust, that was the part that scared me most. I had been taught to trust the organization, the elders, and the governing body as the exclusive source of God's truth. I had been told that questioning them was the same as questioning Jehovah. But now Jesus wasn't asking me to trust men. He was asking me to trust him. A lump formed in my throat. I don't know if I can, I said. Jesus knelt beside me, his gaze searching mine. Why? Tears filled my eyes. Because if I trust you, then I have to accept that I wasted my entire life. My voice cracked. That I spent decades teaching something false. That I led people away from you instead of toward you. The shame overwhelmed me. I had knocked on thousands of doors. I had preached to countless people. I had convinced so many that salvation could only be found through an organization, and I had been wrong. How could I live with that? Jesus exhaled softly. You think I didn't know this about you? He asked gently. I swallowed hard. You think I didn't see your sincerity? I didn't know how to answer him. Jesus reached out and wiped a tear from my cheek. David, I'm not holding your past against you. I'm asking you to step into the truth now. His words hit me like a wave. He wasn't condemning me, he was rescuing me. The weight in my chest grew heavier. I wanted to believe him, but there was still one thing holding me back. What about my family? I whispered. Jesus didn't answer immediately. I thought of my wife, my parents, my siblings, all of them Jehovah's Witnesses, all of them still believing in the organization and the teachings I had just realized were false. If I followed Jesus, I would lose them. I had seen it happen before. People who left the organization were shunned, cut off, treated like they never existed. I had been taught that this was an act of loyalty to Jehovah, a way to protect our faith from corruption, but now I knew the truth. Shunning wasn't about keeping the faith pure, it was about control. I clenched my fist. If I go back and tell them what I saw, they'll never speak to me again. Jesus' expression remained unchanged. Do you trust me? I hesitated. If you follow me, he continued, you will lose many things. You will lose relationships. You will lose the life you once knew. But what you will gain is worth far more. I let out a shaky breath. I already knew he was right. Even if my family turned their backs on me, I couldn't pretend I didn't know the truth. I couldn't go back to believing something that had already been proven false. I had to choose, live a lie to keep my family, or follow Jesus and lose everything. My hands trembled as I looked back at him. Will they ever understand? Jesus gave a small, sad smile. Some will, some won't. I swallowed hard. And if they don't, his expression was steady. Then I will be enough. Tears spilled down my face. I had spent my entire life believing that Jesus was just a secondary figure, that Jehovah was the one I was supposed to be devoted to, that Jesus was just a mediator, nothing more. But standing here, looking into his eyes, I knew something with absolute certainty. Jesus was enough. He had always been enough, and I had spent my entire life missing it. A sob racked my chest. I reached out with a shaking hand and took his. The moment I did, a surge of warmth shot through me. Not just warmth, but life. It was as if every burden, every lie, every false teaching had been burned away in an instant. The weight I had carried for so long, gone. Jesus pulled me to my feet, and for the first time in my life, I knew I was free. I wasn't trapped by doctrine. I wasn't bound to an organization. I wasn't held captive by fear. I was standing in front of the only one who had ever truly mattered, and he had chosen me. I looked down at my hands, and for the first time I noticed something strange. There was something there, a mark, faint but undeniable. I looked at Jesus in confusion. What is this? His eyes were filled with something deep, something powerful. A reminder, he said. A reminder of what? His grip on my hand tightened slightly. That you are mine. My breath caught in my throat. I had spent my whole life believing I belonged to an organization, but I never had. I had belonged to him all along, and now I finally understood. I blinked, staring at the mark on my hand. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. Not ink, not a scar, not something physical. It was deeper than that. I could feel it, even though it wasn't painful. It wasn't a burden. It was a seal, a claim. I was his. The realization sent a shiver through me. Everything I had believed about my faith, about my purpose, about who I was, it had all been wrapped up in an organization. I thought I had to earn God's approval through works, through obedience to men, through loyalty to rules and doctrines, but I had been wrong. I already belonged to Jesus. I always had. I looked up at him, my throat tight. What happens now? His expression was steady, unwavering. You go back. I felt my stomach drop. Back to what? To the life I had before? To the people who would never believe what I had just experienced? I don't know how, I admitted. Jesus held my gaze. You don't have to know how, you just have to trust me? That word again, trust. I had trusted an organization my whole life. I had trusted men to tell me who God was. I had trusted doctrines written by people who claimed to speak for him. And now I had to unlearn all of it because faith wasn't about following an organization. It was about knowing him. I clenched my fists, the weight of it settling over me. What if they don't believe me? Jesus' eyes softened. Some won't. And if they turn their backs on you, then you will still have me. The words pierced through me like a blade. I thought of my family, my friends, my congregation. If I came back from this and told them what I had seen, what I had learned, what I now knew to be true, they would call me deceived. They would say I had been led astray. I would lose them, everything I had ever known. I swallowed hard. What, will I ever get them back? Jesus didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, some will find the truth through you, some will not. That is not for you to decide. The thought was unbearable. I had spent my whole life believing that loyalty to Jehovah's organization was everything. That the people in my life, my spiritual family, were the ones I would be with forever. But now I had to face the reality that following Jesus might cost me everything. I squeezed my eyes shut, struggling to breathe. Jesus stepped closer, his voice gentle. David, I looked at him, my heart breaking. You were willing to give your life for an organization, he said. Will you now live for me? Tears spilled down my face. I had no idea how to do this. I had no idea what would come next. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I took a deep breath. Yes. The moment the word left my lips, everything around me shifted. The light, the warmth, the overwhelming peace, it all started to fade. I panicked. Wait. Jesus reached out, touching my forehead with his hand. Go, he said softly, and tell them the truth. And then everything went black. I gasped, my body jerking violently as air flooded my lungs. Pain, blinding, searing pain. I could feel everything again. The weight of my limbs, the sharp burning in my chest, the pounding in my skull. I was back. I heard voices around me, frantic and relieved. Machines beeping, hands gripping my arms, my shoulders. He's back, someone said. I blinked, trying to adjust to the harsh hospital lights above me. My body felt heavy, like I had been underwater for hours. I could barely move. A nurse hovered over me, her face a mix of shock and relief. You coded, she said. You were gone for nearly 3 minutes. 3 minutes? I swallowed hard. It had felt like a lifetime. My wife was beside me, clutching my hand, her eyes filled with tears. Oh, David, she sobbed. I thought I lost you. I squeezed her hand weakly. I saw him. She blinked. What? I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, my mind still reeling. How could I even begin to explain? I had died. I had met Jesus. And everything I had believed, everything I had spent my life preaching, was wrong. My wife frowned, squeezing my hand tighter. Rest, she said gently. You need to rest. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the reality of it all sink in. I had come back, but I wasn't the same. I couldn't be the same. Everything in my life had changed. I wasn't just a Jehovah's Witness anymore. I wasn't part of an organization. I was his. And I had a mission to tell the truth, to tell his truth, even if it cost me everything.